The wind howled through the broken planks of the old shed, carrying with it the scent of rain and desperation. Kimberly Carter pressed her back against the splintered wood, her threadbare coat pulled tight around her trembling frame. Through the gaps in the walls, she could see the imposing silhouette of the ranch house in the distance, its windows glowing like amber jewels against the darkening sky. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a familiar companion that had walked beside her for weeks now, and her lips moved in a silent prayer to whatever force might be listening in this God-forsaken stretch of Wyoming territory. The shed door creaked open with a sound like breaking bones, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. A tall figure stood framed in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking out what little light remained of the dying day. Mark Wright stepped inside, his boots heavy on the dirt floor, and she could feel his eyes upon her, even in the darkness. There was something in his gaze that made her skin prickle with awareness, something that spoke of loneliness as deep and vast as the prairie itself. She had rehearsed the words 1,000 times in her mind during the long, cold nights, but now they seemed to stick in her throat like thorns. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities and the weight of her desperation. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky like the voice of an angry god, and she knew that whatever happened in the next few moments would change everything. The shed suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the very walls were pressing in around them, forcing a confrontation that neither had sought but both somehow needed. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. 3 weeks earlier, Kimberly Carter had stepped off the dusty stagecoach in the small town of Cedar Falls with nothing but the clothes on her back and 17 cents in her pocket. The driver had looked at her with pity as he handed down her single carpet bag, its worn leather held together with string and stubborn hope. She had thanked him with as much dignity as she could muster, though inside her heart was breaking like ice in spring. The letter in her bag, creased from countless readings, bore news that her sister Nancy had died of consumption, leaving behind debts that had swallowed the small inheritance Kimberly had counted on to start fresh. The town stretched before her like a collection of weathered bones, bleached white by the sun. False-fronted buildings lined the single main street, their paint peeling and their signs faded by wind and time. A few horses stood tethered to hitching posts, their heads hanging low in the heat, and somewhere a dog barked with the lazy persistence of summer afternoons. She had walked the length of the street twice, stopping at every establishment that might offer work to a woman alone, but the answers were always the same. The general store had no need for help. The hotel was full up with staff. The saloon keeper had looked her up and down with calculating eyes before shaking his head with something that might have been regret. By evening, she found herself sitting on a bench outside the church, watching the last light fade from the sky and wondering what she would do when morning came. The preacher, a thin man named Benjamin Jones, had emerged from the building with his wife Joyce, and they had spoken to her with kindness that felt like warm bread after days of hunger. They offered her a meal and a place to sleep in the church basement, but she could see the strain in their faces, the way they counted every coin before spending it. She accepted their charity for one night, knowing she could not impose upon their goodness any longer. The next morning brought news of the Wright Ranch, spoken in whispers by the women at the general store. Mark Wright, they said, was a man who kept to himself on a spread 20 miles north of town. His wife had died 2 years past, leaving him alone with his grief and his cattle. Some said he was touched by madness, others that he was simply too proud to ask for help, but all agreed that he was a man who valued hard work above all else and might be willing to trade labor for shelter. The women looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and warning, as if they understood her desperation but feared for her safety. The walk to the Wright Ranch took her the better part of 2 days, following wagon ruts that wound through endless grassland, broken only by the occasional stand of cottonwoods. She slept the first night under the stars, wrapped in her thin shawl and listening to the coyotes sing their lonesome songs in the distance. Her feet, soft from years of city living, blistered and bled inside her worn boots. But she pressed on with the determination of a woman who had no other choice. The second day brought clouds that promised rain, and she quickened her pace, knowing that a storm on the open prairie could mean death for the unprepared. She first saw the ranch buildings as the sun reached its zenith, wavering in the heat like a mirage that might disappear if she blinked. The main house was built of rough-hewn logs, its roof steep and solid against the sky. Outbuildings scattered around it like children gathered close to their mother, and she could see cattle dotting the pastures beyond. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line, proof that someone was home, and her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the front porch. Mark Wright emerged from the barn before she reached the house, as if he had been watching her approach from the shadows. He was taller than she had expected, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world and hands that spoke of years spent working with rope and leather. His hair was dark with threads of silver at the temples, and his face bore the weathered look of a man who had spent his life under the open sky. But it was his eyes that gave her pause, gray as storm clouds and holding depths she could not fathom. He said nothing as she approached, simply stood with his arms crossed and waited for her to speak. The words she had practiced seemed foolish now, but desperation gave her courage. She told him her name, explained her situation with as much dignity as she could manage, and asked if he might have work for someone willing to do whatever was needed. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, and she met his gaze without flinching, though her knees trembled beneath her skirts. For a long moment, he studied her with those storm-gray eyes, taking in her worn clothes and the proud set of her shoulders. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough from disuse, like gravel in a dry creek bed. He told her there was work to be done, more than one man could handle alone, but the conditions would be hard. The ranch was isolated, the work demanding, and he had no patience for weakness or complaint. If she could not pull her weight, she would find herself back on the road with nothing to show for her trouble. She accepted his terms without hesitation, knowing that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. He showed her to the small cabin that had once housed his hired hand, a single room with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the endless grassland. The furniture was simple but sturdy, and there were blankets on the narrow bed that smelled of cedar and sunshine. It was the first place she had been able to call her own since leaving the city, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. The work began before dawn the next morning, when Mark appeared at her door with a bucket of milk still warm from the cow and bread that tasted like heaven after days of hunger. He showed her the chickens that needed tending, the garden that was fighting a losing battle against the weeds, and the endless list of tasks that kept the ranch running. Her hands, soft from her previous life as a seamstress, quickly blistered and calloused, but she bit back any complaint and threw herself into the work with fierce determination. Days blended into weeks as she found her rhythm in this new life. She learned to milk the cows without getting kicked, to gather eggs from hens that seemed determined to peck her fingers, and to coax vegetables from soil that seemed more dust than earth. Mark watched her with those careful gray eyes, saying little but missing nothing, and gradually she began to sense a grudging respect in his manner. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. When her boots finally gave out completely, she found a new pair on her doorstep the next morning. When the autumn wind turned cold, extra blankets appeared on her bed without explanation. The first real test came with the arrival of the cattle buyers in late September. Gary Perez and his partner Tyler Jimenez rode onto the ranch with the swagger of men who were used to getting their way, their horses prancing and their spurs jingling with every step. They had come to negotiate for Mark's best breeding stock, but their eyes lingered on Kimberly in a way that made her skin crawl. She served them coffee on the porch while Mark discussed business, keeping her expression neutral despite the crude comments they made when they thought he could not hear. Gary Perez was a man who believed that everything had a price, including the dignity of a woman alone on a remote ranch. He made his interest clear with lingering looks and suggestions that grew bolder as the afternoon wore on. When Mark stepped away to show them the cattle, Gary cornered her by the kitchen window, his breath reeking of whiskey and his hands reaching for her waist. She stepped back, her spine straight and her voice steady as she told him to keep his distance, but she could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he measured her isolation against his desire. Tyler Jimenez proved to be cut from the same cloth, though he was more subtle in his approach. He spoke of the loneliness of ranch life, of how a woman might find herself grateful for any company in such a desolate place. His words carried implications that made her stomach turn, but she maintained her composure, knowing that any sign of weakness would only encourage them further. When they finally concluded their business with Mark and prepared to leave, Gary made one final attempt, suggesting that she might consider a change of scenery and offering to take her back to town with them. The offer hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, and she felt Mark's attention sharpen even though he stood 20 feet away, examining a horse's hoof. She declined with polite firmness, but she could see that Gary was not a man accustomed to rejection. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy, but his smile held the promise of future trouble. As they rode away, she noticed that they took the road that led not back to town, but toward the line shack on the eastern boundary of the ranch, and a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air. That evening, Mark found her sitting on the porch of her cabin, staring out at the darkening sky with troubled eyes. He settled beside her without an invitation, his presence solid and reassuring in the gathering dusk. For a long time they sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds of the prairie and the distant lowing of cattle. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. He told her that men like Gary Perez were a plague on the frontier, taking what they wanted without regard for the consequences. He assured her that as long as she remained on his land, she was under his protection, and any man who threatened her would answer to him. His words should have comforted her, but she could not shake the feeling that trouble was coming like a storm on the horizon. That night she lay awake listening to every sound, starting at the cry of an owl or the rustle of wind through the grass. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams of grasping hands and leering faces, and she woke with her heart racing and her nightgown damp with sweat. Outside her window the world remained peaceful, but she could not escape the certainty that this peace was temporary, a calm before the storm that would test everything she had built in this harsh and beautiful place. The next few days passed quietly, but she noticed that Mark had begun to watch the horizon more carefully and that he kept his rifle closer at hand. He said nothing of his concerns, but she could read the tension in the set of his shoulders and the way his eyes scanned the landscape. She threw herself into her work with renewed vigor, as if by keeping busy, she could hold back whatever darkness was approaching. The garden yielded its final harvest, pumpkins and squash that would see them through the winter, and she spent long hours preserving vegetables and preparing for the cold months ahead. It was during this time that she began to truly see the man behind the stoic facade. Mark Wright was not the cold, unfeeling rancher that the townspeople believed him to be. She caught glimpses of his gentler nature in small moments, the way he spoke softly to a frightened calf, the care with which he tended a horse's injured leg, the reverence in his voice when he mentioned his late wife Hannah. He was a man who had learned to guard his heart against further loss, but she could see the loneliness that ate at him like a slow poison. One evening, as they worked together to repair a section of fence damaged by wandering cattle, she found the courage to ask about his wife. His hands stilled on the wire he was stretching, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. Hannah Hughes had been the daughter of a preacher, he told her, a woman with eyes like spring water and a laugh that could chase away the darkest clouds. They had met at a church social in town, and he had known from the first moment that she was meant to be his. Their courtship had been brief but intense, and their marriage had been the happiest time of his life. She had loved the ranch as much as he did, throwing herself into the work with enthusiasm and joy. She had planted the garden that Kimberly now tended, had chosen the curtains that still hung in the windows of the main house, had filled the rooms with laughter and the smell of fresh baked bread. For 5 years they had built their life together, planning for children and dreaming of the future. Then the fever had come, swift and merciless, taking her in 3 days despite all his desperate prayers and the doctor's best efforts. He had buried her on the hill overlooking the valley, beneath the oak tree where they had often sat to watch the sunset. The grief in his voice was still fresh, even after 2 years, and she felt her heart break for him. She understood now why he held himself apart, why he spoke so little, and watched the world with such careful eyes. He was a man who had loved completely and lost everything, and the fear of experiencing such pain again had built walls around his heart that seemed impossible to breach. Yet she could see cracks in those walls, moments when his guard slipped and she glimpsed the man he had been before sorrow changed him. As autumn deepened into winter, Their relationship began to shift in ways that neither fully acknowledged. The work of the ranch threw them together constantly, and she found herself looking forward to their shared meals and the quiet conversations that sometimes followed. He began to seek out her opinion on matters large and small, trusting her judgment in ways that spoke of growing respect. When a blizzard struck in early November, trapping them both in the main house for 3 days, they discovered an easy companionship that surprised them both. It was during that storm that she learned of his past beyond the ranch. Mark Wright had not always been a cattleman. He had served in the war, fighting in battles whose names still haunted his dreams. He had seen friends die and had killed men whose faces he could still remember in the darkest hours of the night. The ranch had been his refuge, a place where he could build something instead of destroying it, where he could nurture life instead of ending it. Hannah had understood this need, had helped him heal from wounds that went deeper than flesh. Without her, he had begun to drift back toward the darkness that the war had planted in his soul. She shared her own story in return, speaking of the seamstress shop she had owned in Chicago, of the customers who had become friends, and of the dreams that had died with her sister's letter. She told him of the fear that had driven her west, the certainty that she had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. In the flickering light of the fireplace, with the wind howling outside like a living thing, they found a connection that transcended the simple arrangement of employer and employee. They were two wounded souls who had found shelter in each other's company, and the realization was both comforting and terrifying. The storm passed, but the intimacy remained, growing stronger with each shared glance and casual touch. She began to notice things about him that she had missed before. The way his eyes crinkled when he almost smiled, the gentleness of his hands when he thought no one was watching, the way he hummed tunelessly while he worked. He in turn seemed to see her with new eyes, appreciating not just her willingness to work, but the quiet strength that had carried her through loss and hardship. They were falling into something deeper than friendship. Though neither dared to name it, winter tightened its grip on the land with the fury of a jealous lover, bringing temperatures that could freeze a man solid in minutes and winds that cut through clothing like knives. The cattle huddled together for warmth in the sheltered valleys, and the daily work of feeding and caring for them became a battle against the elements. Kimberly learned to wrap her face against the cold, to move quickly between buildings, and to read the signs that warned of approaching storms. Her hands, now strong and capable, could milk cows even when her fingers were numb with cold, and she took pride in her ability to match Mark's pace despite the harsh conditions. It was during one of these bitter cold spells that Jack Thompson appeared at their door like a specter from Mark's past. He was a tall, lean man with eyes like chips of ice and a smile that never reached them. He claimed to be an old Army friend passing through, but there was something in the way he looked at the ranch, cataloging its assets and defenses, that set Kimberly's nerves on edge. Mark welcomed him with the courtesy due to an old comrade, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his hand never strayed far from his gun. Jack Thompson had not come alone, though his companions remained hidden in the hills surrounding the ranch. He spoke of old times and shared battles, but his conversation was peppered with questions about the ranch's prosperity and its isolation. He commented on the quality of the cattle, the richness of the land, and the distance to the nearest neighbors with the calculating eye of a man making an inventory. When he learned of Kimberly's presence, his interest sharpened noticeably, and she felt like a rabbit being studied by a hawk. On the second night of his visit, she was returning from the barn when she overheard voices from the bunkhouse where Jack was staying. The conversation was low and urgent, and though she could not make out all the words, she caught enough to freeze her blood. They were planning something, she realized, something that involved the ranch and its isolated location. She heard her own name mentioned, along with references to Gary Perez and Tyler Jimenez, and suddenly the pieces of a larger puzzle began to fall into place. She slipped away without being seen and made her way to the main house, where she found Mark cleaning his rifle by the light of a kerosene lamp. The sight of him there, solid and dependable in the lamplight, made her realize how much she had come to depend on his presence. She told him what she had overheard, watching as his face grew grim with understanding. He had suspected that Jack's visit was not as innocent as it seemed, But hearing confirmation of his fears brought a cold fury to his eyes that reminded her of the soldier he had once been. They spent the night planning, speaking in whispers as they prepared for whatever was to come. Mark revealed that he had noticed signs of other men in the area, tracks in the snow and evidence of camps in the hills. Jack Thompson was not just an old friend seeking shelter. He was the advanced scout for a larger force, men who saw the isolated ranch as easy prey. The cattle alone would be worth a fortune, but Kimberly suspected that their plans went beyond simple rustling. Men like Gary Perez did not forget slights, and she had made an enemy when she rejected his advances. As dawn broke gray and cold over the prairie, Jack Thompson made his excuses and prepared to leave. He shook Mark's hand with apparent warmth, but his eyes remained calculating and cold. He tipped his hat to Kimberly with exaggerated courtesy, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. As he rode away, she noticed that he took the trail that led toward the eastern hills, where smoke from hidden campfires might blend with the morning mist. The attack came 3 days later, just as the sun was setting and painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Kimberly was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast. Through the window, she could see riders coming from 3 directions, their faces masked and their intentions clear. Mark appeared at her side, his rifle in his hands and his face set in grim lines. The time for preparation was over. The storm they had been expecting had finally arrived. The first shots shattered the evening silence like breaking glass, and Kimberly dropped to the floor as bullets splintered the window frame above her head. Mark returned fire from behind the solid oak table he had overturned for cover, his shots measured and precise. Outside, she could hear the voices of their attackers, at least 6 men by her count, calling to each other as they surrounded the house. Gary Perez's voice rose above the others, crude and confident, promising that they would take what they wanted one way or another. Mark's preparations proved their worth as the siege began in earnest. He had reinforced the windows with heavy shutters, stockpiled ammunition, and positioned water barrels throughout the house in case of fire. The thick log walls that had seemed rustic now revealed their true purpose as fortress barriers, turning aside bullets that would have punched through frame construction. But Kimberly knew that their advantages were temporary. They were outnumbered and surrounded, and their enemies had time on their side. The attackers tried several approaches as the night wore on. They attempted to rush the house under cover of darkness, only to be driven back by Mark's accurate shooting. They tried to set fire to the barn, hoping to draw him out. But the recent snows had dampened the wood too thoroughly for the flames to catch. They called out taunts and threats, promising to spare their lives if they surrendered. But the crude laughter that followed made it clear what kind of mercy they could expect. As the hours passed, Kimberly found herself moving with a calm efficiency that surprised her. She reloaded Mark's spare rifle, brought him water and ammunition, and kept watch at the back windows while he covered the front. The terror she had expected never came. Instead, she felt a cold clarity that sharpened her senses and steadied her hands. This was her home they were attacking, her life they were threatening, and she would not go down without a fight. Near midnight, the attackers changed tactics. Tyler Jimenez called out from the darkness, his voice smooth and reasonable. He claimed they only wanted the cattle and would leave peacefully if Mark would simply step aside. But his words were contradicted by Gary Perez's harsh laughter and crude comments about what they planned to do with the woman once they had dealt with her protector. The mask of civilization had fallen away completely, revealing the predators beneath. Mark's response was a bullet that sent Tyler diving for cover, and the pretense of negotiation ended. The attack resumed with renewed fury, bullets hammering the shutters and probing for weaknesses in their defenses. One shot found a gap in the kitchen window, shattering a plate on the shelf and sending ceramic shards flying. Another punched through the door, embedding itself in the far wall with a solid thunk that spoke of deadly intent. It was then that Kimberly made a discovery that changed everything. While searching for more ammunition in Mark's bedroom, she found a loose floorboard that concealed a cache of weapons and supplies. But it was not the guns that caught her attention. It was the uniform folded carefully beneath them, bearing the insignia of a cavalry officer and the medal that spoke of heroism in battles whose names were written in blood and glory. Mark Wright was not just a former soldier. He was a decorated war hero, a man who had led charges against impossible odds and lived to tell the tale. The knowledge filled her with a fierce pride and an even fiercer determination. If Mark could face Confederate cavalry and live, he could certainly handle a handful of rustlers and thieves. But she also understood that his greatest battles had been fought not against external enemies, but against the demons that war had planted in his soul. Hannah had helped him find peace, and her death had nearly broken him. Now it was Kimberly's turn to stand beside him, to be the strength he needed to face this new threat. Dawn came gray and bitter, bringing with it a temporary lull in the fighting. The attackers had pulled back to reassess their situation, and in the silence Kimberly could hear them arguing among themselves. Some wanted to continue the siege, confident that time was on their side. Others pushed for a direct assault, impatient with the delay and eager for the rewards that waited beyond the log walls. Gary Perez's voice rose above the others, harsh with frustration and growing desperation. Mark used the respite to check their defenses and count their remaining ammunition. The news was not encouraging. They had perhaps 50 rounds left, barely enough for another sustained attack. Water was not a problem thanks to the well in the basement, but food was running low. More troubling was the smoke she had noticed rising from the direction of town. Their attackers had allies, it seemed, and the isolated ranch was becoming even more cut off from potential help. It was then that she made her decision. While Mark dozed fitfully in a chair by the front window, she slipped out through the root cellar that connected to the barn. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but she pressed on, moving carefully through the shadows toward the hills where she had seen the enemy campfire. If she could reach their horses, scatter them or drive them off, she might be able to even the odds or at least buy them time. The plan was desperate, born of desperation and fueled by the fierce protectiveness she felt for the man who had given her shelter and purpose. She had learned to move quietly during her weeks on the ranch, and the fresh snow muffled her footsteps as she worked her way around the perimeter of their position. Behind her, the house stood dark and silent, giving no sign of the drama playing out within its walls. She found their camp in a sheltered draw half a mile from the house, where the horses were tethered in a rough corral made of rope and stakes. The guards were huddled around a small fire, more concerned with staying warm than watching for intruders. She counted 7 horses, more than enough for the 6 men she had identified, which meant there might be others she had not seen. The knowledge sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold, but she pressed on with her plan. Moving like a ghost in the pre-dawn darkness, she began cutting the ropes that held the horses. The animals sensed her presence but remained calm, perhaps recognizing something gentle in her approach. One by one she freed them, whispering soft words of encouragement as she worked. When the last rope parted, she stepped back and clapped her hands sharply, sending the horses scattering into the night with a thunder of hoofbeats that echoed off the hills. The guards leaped to their feet with curses and shouts, but it was too late. The horses were gone, vanished into the darkness like spirits fleeing the dawn. She turned to run, but Gary Perez appeared from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh, his gun trained on her heart and his face twisted with rage. He had been expecting something like this, he told her, had been watching and waiting for her to make exactly this kind of mistake. The walk back to the house was a death march, with Gary's gun pressed against her spine and his threats whispered in her ear. He spoke of what he would do to her once Mark was dead, of the entertainment she would provide for him and his men before they finally tired of their game. His words were meant to break her spirit, to reduce her to a cowering victim, but they had the opposite effect. Instead of fear, she felt a cold anger building in her chest, a fury that burned away her terror and left only determination. Mark was waiting for them when they reached the house, his rifle trained on Gary Perez, with the steady hands of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to do so again. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with death balanced on the edge of a trigger pull. Gary held Kimberly in front of him like a human shield, but she could see in Mark's eyes that he was calculating angles and distances, looking for the shot that would end this without harming her. The other attackers emerged from their hiding places, drawn by the confrontation, and suddenly the odds had shifted dramatically. With their horses scattered and their leader exposed, they were no longer the confident predators who had begun the siege. Some looked ready to cut their losses and flee on foot, while others seemed prepared to fight to the bitter end. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone present knew that the next few moments would determine who lived and who died. It was then that Jack Thompson made his reappearance, stepping out of the barn with his own gun drawn and a cold smile on his lips. He had been waiting, he explained, for exactly this moment. The siege had served its purpose, drawing Mark's attention while he positioned himself for the killing shot. Now he had both his old comrade and the woman at his mercy, and he could finish what Gary Perez had started. But Jack had made a crucial error in his calculations. He had underestimated the woman he saw as merely a prize to be claimed, failing to recognize the steel that had been forged in her during the long months of hardship and struggle. As he spoke, gloating over his cleverness, she felt the small knife she used for kitchen work pressing against her thigh where it was hidden in her skirt. Gary's attention was focused on Mark and Jack, his grip on her arm loose with overconfidence. The blade slid between his ribs like a whisper, finding the gap in his coat with the precision born of desperation and fury. Gary's eyes widened in shock and pain, his grip loosening as he stumbled backward. She twisted away from him, diving toward the cover of the porch as Mark's rifle spoke with thunder and lightning. Jack Thompson spun and fell, his dreams of easy wealth dying with him in the snow that was already turning red with blood. The remaining attackers broke and ran, their courage failing them in the face of unexpected resistance and the death of their leaders. Some made it to the hills. Others fell to Mark's pursuing shots, but within minutes the siege was over. The ranch was theirs again, bought with blood and defended with courage that neither had known they possessed. In the sudden silence that followed, they stood looking at each other across the battlefield of their front yard, both changed by what they had endured and what they had discovered about themselves. Kimberly looked down at the knife in her hand, its blade stained with Gary Perez's blood, and felt no regret. She had defended her home, her life, and the man who had become more precious to her than she had dared to admit. The scared, desperate woman who had begged for work in a shed seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone stronger and more certain of her place in the world. Mark crossed the space between them in 3 quick strides, his rifle forgotten as he pulled her into his arms. She could feel the tremor in his hands, the aftermath of battle, and the fear he had felt for her safety. They held each other in the growing light of dawn, 2 survivors who had found something worth fighting for in each other's arms. The ranch stretched around them, peaceful now in the morning light, but they both knew that this was only the beginning of their story together. The days that followed the siege passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. The bodies had to be dealt with, the authorities in town notified, and the damaged defenses repaired. Mark rode to Cedar Falls to report the attack, taking with him the weapons and personal effects of the dead men as evidence of their intentions. The sheriff, a practical man named Benjamin Jones, who had seen his share of frontier justice, asked few questions and seemed satisfied that the ranch had defended itself against unprovoked aggression. The townspeople's attitude toward Mark began to change as word of the battle spread. Where once they had seen a bitter recluse, they now saw a man who had stood his ground against impossible odds. More importantly, they began to see Kimberly not as a charity case or a fallen woman, but as someone who had proven her worth in the most fundamental way possible. She had faced death and emerged victorious, earning a respect that no amount of gossip could diminish. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the land, giving way to the tentative warmth of early spring. The work of the ranch resumed its familiar rhythm. But everything had changed between Mark and Kimberly. The walls he had built around his heart had crumbled in the face of almost losing her, and she had discovered a strength and purpose she had never known she possessed. They worked side by side with an easy partnership that spoke of deep trust and growing affection. The first real conversation about their future came on a warm evening in March, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Mark spoke haltingly at first, his words careful and measured, but gradually gaining strength as he saw the answering warmth in her eyes. He told her that the ranch needed a woman's touch, that he needed her presence to make it truly a home again. But more than that, he needed her strength and courage to help him face whatever challenges lay ahead. She listened with her heart in her throat, hardly daring to believe that this strong, honorable man was offering her not just security, but love. When he finally asked her to marry him, the words came out in a rush of emotion that surprised them both. She said yes without hesitation, knowing that this was where she belonged, where she had always been meant to be. The desperate woman who had begged for work in a broken-down shed had found not just survival, but a love that would sustain her through whatever storms might come. The wedding was held in the little church in Cedar Falls, with most of the town in attendance despite the short notice. Joyce Moore, the preacher's wife, had worked tirelessly to organize the ceremony, enlisting the help of other women who had come to admire Kimberly's courage and determination. The dress was simple but beautiful, sewn from fabric that Mark had ordered specially from the city, and she had never felt more beautiful than when she saw the look in his eyes as she walked down the aisle. The ceremony itself was brief but moving, with words that spoke of love tested by hardship and proven true by adversity. When Mark slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, she felt as if she were finally coming home after a long and difficult journey. The congregation sang hymns that echoed off the rafters, and even the most hardened ranchers found themselves wiping away tears as the couple exchanged their vows. The reception was held in the church hall, with food contributed by every family in town, and music provided by Tyler Jimenez's brother, who played the fiddle with surprising skill. People who had once looked at her with suspicion now came forward to offer their congratulations and best wishes. She was no longer the stranger who had arrived with nothing. She was Mrs. Mark Wright, mistress of one of the most successful ranches in the territory, and a woman who had proven her mettle in the crucible of frontier life. The return to the ranch as husband and wife felt like the completion of a circle that had begun in desperation and ended in joy. Mark carried her over the threshold with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, and she knew that she had finally found the place where she belonged. The house that had once seemed so empty and cold now felt warm and welcoming, filled with the promise of the life they would build together. The months that followed were the happiest of her life, filled with the simple pleasures of shared work and quiet companionship. She transformed the house with her woman's touch, adding curtains and flowers, filling the rooms with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of laughter. Mark seemed to grow younger before her eyes, the lines of grief and loneliness gradually fading as he rediscovered the joy of living fully. The ranch prospered under their joint management, with the cattle multiplying and the land yielding its bounty to their careful stewardship. They hired additional hands to help with the work, men who came to respect both Mark's leadership and Kimberly's practical wisdom. The isolation that had once seemed like a burden now felt like a blessing, giving them the privacy to build their relationship without the interference of well-meaning neighbors. By autumn, Kimberly knew that their family would soon be growing. The signs were unmistakable, and when she shared the news with Mark, his joy was so complete and overwhelming that she thought her heart might burst with happiness. They spent long evenings planning for the future, talking about the children they would raise and the legacy they would leave. The ranch would continue for another generation, built on the foundation of love and mutual respect they had established. The birth came in late spring, with Joyce Moore serving as midwife and Mark pacing the porch like a caged animal, until the baby's first cry announced the successful arrival of their son. When he was finally allowed to enter the room, the sight of his wife holding their child reduced him to tears of gratitude and wonder. They named the boy Samuel after Mark's father, and he grew strong and healthy under their devoted care. As summer turned to autumn and the cycle of seasons continued, Kimberly often found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this place of contentment. The desperate woman who had once begged for work in a tumble-down shed seemed like a character from someone else's story. So far had she traveled from that moment of despair. She had discovered that strength was not something you were born with, but something you developed through facing adversity with courage and determination. The ranch continued to thrive, becoming known throughout the territory as a model of successful management and fair dealing. Mark's reputation as a man of integrity drew business from far and wide, and their home became a stopping place for travelers who knew they would find honest hospitality and a warm welcome. The isolation that had once defined their existence gave way to a steady stream of visitors who brought news from the outside world and took with them stories of the remarkable couple who had built something lasting on the harsh frontier. The townspeople of Cedar Falls came to regard them as pillars of the community, the kind of people who could be counted on in times of trouble and who set an example for others to follow. When disputes arose, they often sought Mark's mediation, trusting his judgment and fair-mindedness. When families faced hardship, they knew that the Wright Ranch would provide whatever help was needed, no questions asked. Years passed like the turning of seasons, each bringing its own challenges and rewards. Samuel grew into a strong, capable boy who learned the ways of the ranch from his parents and showed every sign of continuing their legacy. Other children followed, daughters who inherited their mother's determination and sons who carried their father's quiet strength. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the laughter and voices of a growing family. Kimberly often stood on the porch in the evening, watching her children play in the yard while Mark tended to the evening chores. In those moments, she felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond mere contentment. She had not just survived the trials that had brought her to this place, she had thrived, building a life of meaning and purpose from the ashes of her former existence. The woman who had once felt worthless and discarded had discovered her true value in the love of a good man and the family they had created together. The challenges of frontier life continued to test them, but they faced each obstacle as partners, drawing strength from their shared commitment and mutual trust. Droughts came and went, cattle prices fluctuated, and neighbors sometimes faced troubles that required their help. But through it all, they maintained the bond that had been forged in those desperate hours when they fought for their lives and their future. Mark never lost the quiet strength that had first attracted her, but the bitter loneliness that had once defined him was replaced by a deep contentment that showed in every aspect of his life. He was a man who had found his purpose not just in the work of his hands, but in the love of his family. The war that had scarred his soul seemed like a distant memory, healed by years of peace and the gentle ministrations of a woman who understood the value of patience and persistence. As she grew older, Kimberly took pride in the knowledge that she had helped build something that would endure long after she was gone. The ranch would pass to their children, who would carry forward the values of hard work, integrity, and mutual respect that had been the foundation of their parents' success. The desperate flight from Chicago that had once seemed like the end of her world had actually been the beginning of everything that truly mattered. The shed where she had first sheltered still stood at the edge of the property, though it was now used for storing tools and equipment rather than housing desperate refugees. Sometimes she would walk past it and remember the woman she had been in that moment of ultimate despair, when death had seemed preferable to the uncertainty that lay ahead. That woman could never have imagined the life that awaited her, the love that would sustain her, or the strength she would discover within herself when circumstances demanded it. On quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep, she and Mark would sit together on the porch and watch the stars emerge in the vast prairie sky. They spoke little during these times, having learned that some forms of communication transcended words. They had built their life together one day at a time, one challenge at a time, proving that love grounded in mutual respect and shared purpose could overcome any obstacle that life might place in their path. The story of their courtship became legend in the territory, told and retold around campfires and in parlors as an example of how two people could find each other, even in the darkest of circumstances. But for Kimberly, the real miracle was not in the dramatic events that had brought them together, but in the quiet moments of everyday life that had followed. She had learned that true happiness was not found in grand gestures or passionate declarations, but in the steady accumulation of shared experiences and mutual devotion. As the years turned into decades, she never lost her gratitude for the second chance that life had given her. The woman who had once begged for work and shelter had become the mistress of a prosperous ranch, the mother of a growing family, and the partner of a man whose love had transformed her understanding of what was possible. She had discovered that strength was not the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to face uncertainty with hope and determination, trusting that love could indeed conquer all.